So we're gonna go ahead and get started. So a couple notes on what we're covering today. It should be about 45 minutes. I wanna make sure if there's any questions or comments, ideas, we capture those at the end. We're looking at two models for organizing notes. One is based on a template that is free, and I'll drop the link in the chat. So that's the Essentials Notes template, at least the basics on what you need to get started. And then this idea of atomic notes, where it's the idea that notes can aggregate over time and they could be connected to different databases, right? So we don't necessarily need to have them siloed in their own space. If we haven't met or haven't interfaced, my name's Dave DeCespedes. I'm in Miami, Florida. I was born and raised here, and I'm a remote ops consultant, so I help teams, companies, academic institutions migrate to Notion and set up systems in Notion. And I also do one-on-one coaching in some cases. Lately, it's been primarily working with companies and organizations. Fun fact, I taught high school technology. Up until about 4 months ago, I was doing that full-time and running a essentially full-time Notion consulting business, and made the tough decision to leave teaching, but doing a lot of fun and exciting work in operations. And also another fun fact, I actually studied and worked in architecture before moving into digital consulting. So very much a common meandering path that more and more of us are taking. So before we get into notes, I got a very, very quick announcement. I know some of us are already in the community called Notion Creators, but very excited about this, launching this in 6 or 7 weeks or so publicly. I'm working with a small group of people in the current community, really focusing on how do we move past working with and existing resources to build our own systems and our own workspaces and workflows to get the most out of Notion. And in my experience, a lot of this magic happens beyond using templates and really getting into identifying how do we work best, and what do we want to track and organize, and what does that look like when we create our own workspace. But the goal for this community long-term is to have channels where we have spaces to talk about entrepreneurship, or talking about managing our business and tracking personal hobbies and interests in Notion. So having spaces to do that, and wherever I can assist in getting the most out of Notion and sharing tips and tricks that we may not have known prior, but really just supporting that process. But looking ahead a little bit, there's generally going to be 3 different tiers. There's going to be kind of like a free and open space within the community for people to join and intro and hopefully make meaningful connections, and access to a suite of free templates that I've made over the past several months and maybe years at this point. A creator level, which is more about using Notion to create resources for clients or for particular projects, also including this Notion bootcamp. And then a 3rd tier, which is a space to have for my one-on-one coaching clients to have one-on-one interaction and engagement, but also leverage a community aspect. So clients being able to connect with one another and maybe make connections and share resources the same way the larger community will. So I'm excited about these, but I just wanted to share that real quick. And it's launched in December. Okay, getting into the meat of it, notes. Want to get into why we want to organize notes in the first place. So this is something that has definitely evolved personally in terms of how I'm organizing notes and what role they play in my general workspace. When we think about notes and organizing them, we're probably familiar with Apple Notes, Google Keep, Evernote in terms of being able to quickly jot down an idea or thought and later on revisit it and organize it into something that could be useful in the future, right? We're leaving a note for our future selves in some form or another. The model that has clicked mostly for me is thinking about notes as these things that can aggregate and really create new and creative ideas from things that already exist. So if you're throwing on a podcast and quickly adding little snippets and ideas and questions, that might be useful in the future. But the idea that they can aggregate into bigger, more unique, more creative work, something that's been super interesting. Also, if we kind of think back a little bit, the pervasiveness of overwhelm and kind of overwork is a very real thing. When we think of jotting down notes and being able to review and revisit ideas can also seem like a very overwhelming, daunting process in and of itself if we don't have systems in place to kind of automatically organize things or drop notes into specific buckets and have a clear workflow on what to do with those notes, how to archive them, what to do if you're organizing notes in a notebook. So it's really about defining what kind of systems that make most sense for you to not only capture notes, but work with them and revisit them. This is a really interesting quote from Tiago Forte's Building a Second Brain. When we think about organization in general and not necessarily knowing where information is or where notes are, this specifically relates to notes in terms of if you've, at least I have, in my Apple Notes and prior to using Notion in Evernote, in Google Keep, different Gmail accounts in Google Keep, having these like graveyards of notes that just end up being more and more daunting to go back and organize. And also looking back on notes and not really understanding what the note might mean and maybe missing some context there. This is something that from a broader productivity standpoint, big goal of being more productive or being more organized is to really have more time for the creative work or the work that matters most. So if you haven't checked out the book, I definitely recommend. So as long as you have a system in place that works, even if it uses multiple tools, that's totally okay. This really just dives into Notion in particular on how it might in a Notion kind of series of databases and a dashboard. So first thing, this also goes back to Tiago Forte and the whole building a second brain model. But this is one of the things that I want to build first. So we're going to build two versions of a notes dashboard, but this model is really great at summing up a process for with our notes. So when we think about capture, like having an inbox where you can in 1 or 2 clicks drop in an idea or question and revisit it later. Maybe it's tied to a current or future project. Maybe it's revisiting your goals, but having a way to capture those ideas quickly and effectively, that's where paper, like the physical paper has a lot of big benefits going for it. Second step is organizing. So once we've got those notes in an inbox or in a space, kind of a holding space, what do we do with it? Where does it go? Do we tag it with a certain keyword or keywords? Do we move it to a notebook? How do we act on it and make sure that it's accessible in the future for when we might need it or when we might want to revisit it? In Distill and Express, this is really about acting on the note. So if we're grabbing a snippet from a podcast, distilling is writing a quick summary on what the topic is about or why it's important to you, and expressing is a piece of content that is new and that's something that comes from your perspective and is not quite summarizing an existing idea or reference material, but creating a new idea from that. So like kind of a seed that's growing into its own plant or tree, for instance. So if you're a creator, those last 2 steps are very relevant because it could be a great source of content creation and thinking of topics that are of interest to you or to your distilling and summarizing and putting your own spin on that content is mostly relevant because it's your unique voice, right? And it's a new perspective. So what I want to do next is I want to shift over to Notion, but I want to kind of build this code dashboard, like going through, capturing, organizing, distilling, and expressing. Also in the template link, there's a demo space. So this is something that has come up with client work where clients kind of want to see what would this look like, 3 or 6 months from now in use and actively used among myself or my team, for instance. But, it could be helpful to you in terms of understanding what are notebooks, notes, and then these 2, inbox and archive. But we're going to be actually using this demo space for creating our code dashboard. To give some brief context on how this template works, these 2 sections down here, everything in this template runs off of these 2 databases. There's a notes database, so we can see here all of the properties associated. This could also get a lot more complex and you can connect notes into different areas of your workspace. We'll get into that in the second scenario. But we've got the note itself, a description, if you're adding more context, like distilling or expressing. Any tags that are associated, we're gonna add some tags today. And then also what notebook the note is attached to. There's checkboxes for inbox and archive. This is used to filter if you create a note in the inbox, it's automatically checked, so you don't have to manually kind of plug in information. Anywhere that you could avoid manual entry is a big one, and there's a lot of opportunities within Notion to avoid that with templates and with filtered views. So that's essentially it for the notes database. If we jump into the notebooks, This is really a space to organize notes. So you've probably seen notes can be tagged or can be categorized using the select tool. One of the big reasons I prefer the notebooks being organized in the database is it allows for really cool filtering and displaying of notes organized by notebook. So what do we mean by that? If we go back into the home page, we see here, this is a list of our notebooks. So simple. If we open up this notebook, this is a course I'm currently taking as an example, it's automatically filtered to show any notes that are related to that notebook. So there's two views. There's a gallery view if you kind of prefer the card model, or a simple list view, which gives you the name of the note entry, and then you can always go into that note, and in this case, have some added context for that note, and you've got the notebook that is tied to. So relational databases is a big jump if you are new to Notion or if you're kind of exploring it, and it could be tricky in cases, but I definitely recommend if you've got a lot of stuff that's like notes or tasks or projects, there's a lot of benefits to organizing them in databases and being able to connect and filter. Again, we're going back to, can you find this thing like 3, 6, or 9 months into the future, and can you find it easily and connect it to things that you're working on? So these other 3 sections, this is the main kind of control center of the notes. So if we open up the filters, it's sorted by last edited, so the most recent notes are going to show up first. And there's 2 additional filters. So the inbox is unchecked and the archive is unchecked. Meaning, if I have something in the inbox, I can see here that the inbox is checked. But if I want to drag this into my notes, now if I open this up, the inbox is unchecked. So it's a way to kind of like use filters to not have to do that manually. And then if I want to archive it, I can always drop it into, let me go back a few steps. If I want to archive it, I can also go in here and then uncheck and check, and then it'll drop into the archive. So that's just a quick run through, but I do want to jump into the code dashboard, which we're going to make from scratch. So I'm going to make a little divider here, and we're going to create toggles for each of these sections. So I'm going to say capture, and then I'm going to press Command D on a Mac a couple more times, and then relabel these organize, distill, and express. And these are going to be the main steps in that code process. One of the big benefits of toggles side is one of the challenges I came across when I first got into Notion and was exploring and buying templates and trying to make them work was, more often than not, there was just a lot of stuff on the page, and it was very hard to navigate and focus attention into a particular part without kind of getting distracted by other parts of the workspace. So in the manifest template, which we'll briefly take a look at later, I like to lean on toggles to open up a specific action that I'm doing at that moment, only see that information, and then close it to open up another section. So this also could be a useful way to access large amounts of information in a clean way. So we've got these empty toggles. What I'm going to do here is similar to how we have an inbox, because I have a database view of this that's filtered to inbox being checked. What I'm gonna do is copy a link to this database, and I'm just gonna press Command V here to show that in the capture toggle. And then if let's add a inbox note here. Cool, so we've got that in there. So we've got that set. This is a space to quickly jot down ideas, not really doing anything else here. Until we organize it. So with organize, let's say we want to have a space where we have our inbox notes that haven't been organized, and then we have another view where we have our notes organized by notebook. So what would that look like? What I'm going to do first is create 2 columns here, so I can highlight these and turn into columns. I'm going to duplicate this capture view. I'm going to drop it into the first column. Let's make that a little bit smaller. And then let's say we want to change this from a gallery view to a list view. So I'm going to do that here. So again, if I open up that filter, this is only stuff that's where the inbox is checked. For the next column, what I want to do is show notes organized by notebook. So this is where data can get really helpful. So if we go into, I'm going to use this view as a starting point. So I'm going to duplicate this because it has some filters set up that I'm going to use. But I want to not only see the notes, but I want to organize them by notebook. So if I go to the menu and group, I can decide to group by any relation that's connected to this database. So if I group by notebook, what that's going to do is set up a new view with toggles. Let's hide the no notebooks because I want to make sure if I'm organizing, I'm moving a note to a particular notebook. But you can see here, this is organizing notes by notebook, and I could collapse these the same way I'm doing in the toggles in general. And let's say I've got this landing page idea and I want to drop it into my website. Because I have these filters set up where inbox is unchecked and archive is unchecked, that means that moving this into this view is going to move it out of the inbox. So this is one example of creating a little step in your workflow to process notes in a way that's 1 or 2 clicks. So whether you do it weekly or whether you do it every few days, organizing things into notebooks just kind of allows you to have some peace of mind in terms of knowing where these notes are. So we've got organize, moving inbox notes into our kind of master list. This might also be a view that makes more sense to you in that main notes space. So again, there's a huge variety of how you can present information and how you can filter it. So these are just showing some examples of what you may do with something like notes. So we've got this organize system set up. Now let's get into Distill. Probably won't get to Express just because it's writing and creating new content around an idea. So that's hard to model. And I do want to jump into the atomic scenario also. But in Distill, this is really going to be about taking a note that maybe you captured weeks or months ago and adding some context or adding any relevant information or summaries to that note. So what do we mean by that? If we go into, I'm going to duplicate this view that we created, and we're going to drop this into this Distill section. One alternative way to work through a process like this is setting up a tag, in this case for each part of code. So if we open up any note, you'll see here that there's a tags property. So we could say we have a capture, organize, distill, and express. So let's say that this is in the organize phase. What I'm going to do is let's open that up here. We would set up a filter for organizing. So I would say in this section, I only want to see notes that are in the organize stage. So if I wanted to go to group and hide empty groups, this will only show you notes that are in the organize phase, and that'll show up here as well. Because this is already pre-filtered, you can probably hide the title because we know it's notes, and we can probably hide that tag. But for Distill, let's say we want this to only show notes that are in the Distill phase, as an example. So there's nothing in there because we just created the tag, but we'll turn off the grouping for now. So this is empty, but if we go back up into our notes, let's say we've got this note, improve landing page, say clean up copy, revise images. And then once I've got those in there, I'm going to move this into Distill as like the stage of the note. So now that's showing up in this Distill part of the notes dashboard. So 2 examples of ways to do that. You might not necessarily need the tagging, but tagging is kind of a quick way to be able to filter large amounts of data or large amounts of documents. So if we were to continue along that process, you would see which notes are in the Distill phase, which ones are in the Express. Express would probably be a similar version of this database view of our notes to see like which notes have been kind of expanded on and I could potentially create content around or act on, versus notes that I've kind of distilled but haven't thought much more on. So this is one example using the C.O.D.E system. You might also not have or need a formal step-by-step process. You might just kind of go into your notebooks and say, okay, I'm focusing on notes. I'm going into this space. I'm reviewing my notes, adding some context, adding some further detail. And that's could be sufficient in terms of your workflow if that's something that you're comfortable in or doing, as a habit, right? So that's looking at two databases, notes and notebooks. We've got that carried out. And then this is also, if we go into the notes template, this also has some, existing content to kind of get you going. I definitely recommend going through, identifying if this is something that you're using versus like referencing, going through and deciding like what are 2 or 3 notebooks that you would use or would create on paper to organize your information. You might have general goals, long-term goals, or notes or marketing notes. Maybe it's based on your industry, things like that. And again, a big goal and a big factor, especially when it comes to like working with clients, is trying to edit out any information that's not relevant or not kind of critical to that particular work, to be able to improve and sustain focus. So at any given moment, deciding what is the essential information that you want to see in a particular dashboard. So switching gears to the second model, we're looking at atomic notes and thinking through what does it look like if notes are connected to every part of your workspace, including projects, goals, daily planner. It's not as complicated as it sounds if it's set up the right way. So we're gonna get that going. If we think about notes, they are useful for capturing information. What I found also is that notes can be super valuable to not only organize ideas, but do things like set intentions. If you're journaling, like organizing gratitude statements and being able to reflect on those, show me all of my gratitude entries for the year, could be really, really powerful, not only professionally or from a productivity standpoint, but just from a general reflection standpoint, seeing what ideas have come up, what thoughts have gotten onto paper, over an extended period of time. So connecting to things like planners, projects, and goals. That's what we're going to look at briefly here in this next scenario before we jump into questions. So if we go into, and I'm going to use the manifest template as an example. So brief context, if you haven't seen it or haven't used it, it's a personal productivity template that organizes everything into these focus boards. So going back to that idea of, can I only see the information I need for particular actions? And a space for databases. So I've also talked about this a lot, but making a distinction between boards and databases can also be really helpful, because if we look at databases, this could be very overwhelming, right? If you've got a full database view that have everything visible, it's kind of hard to interface with, right? In which case we would set up a focus board to filter to only specific information. In that example, if I go to, let's say like my planner, let's go into I'm going to jump into the demo space. So this is also, what does this look like if it's lived in for a few weeks or months? And then this is also an area where if I'm kind of doing deep dives on, I'm throwing those into the Notion creators, soon to be NotionTogether community. But if we go into my planner, this has a section that is only filtered to, in this case, today. So these are all kind of like driven by templates. So if you're tracking habits, if you're tracking like feelings or emotions, journal entries, this is bringing in tasks. Key thing to note here is this is only filtered to today, right? Don't want to get super into this, but just to bring some context as to what role notes is going to play. So we're going to use this demo space to add in some notes in different areas of our workspace, and then go into that notes database to see how those things are connected. So let's go into our daily planner. So if I go into the Manifest OS dashboard, this has like some affirmations, quick capture, also something that's visible here. This has a broader view, so it's automatically filtered to the current week. So let's say we're in Wednesday currently, and I want to go in here. There's some tags set up. This is called journal, but this is technically looking at a filtered view of our notes database. Let's say I'm at the end of the day and I want to log at least one win and one challenge. What I can do here is, I had a great client meeting this morning, and challenge, say Hila didn't sleep too well, which is true. If baby's up, that means parents are up. So we've got these, a win and a challenge. This is filtered to the current day, and it's only showing these tags in a board view. So when I add a new note here, it's automatically tagged win or challenge, and these are specifically kind of like journal entries. So those are two notes that have been technically added to my notes database, but I'm never really going into that notes database and seeing these unless I want to reflect on journal entries. If we jump ahead a little bit, go into our weekly planner. This is also something that we had a course on earlier in the year on what steps we can go through in terms of planning the week and reflecting on the week as we get to the end and being able to kind of set ourselves up for success for future weeks. So this is set up in a very different way where we're using these kind of different database snapshots within one page. I'm going to jump to this very last one, which is notes. So what I'm going to do here is create a new note, and because of the filters that are set up, this is automatically tagged as reflection, and I'm going to make sure that I tag it with the current week. Let's say 42. So this is a reflection. It's tied to week 42. It's technically also going into the notes database, but it's tagged with reflection, and it's also connected to this week, which is its own database. Let's do one more, and then we'll kind of look at the notes database and what this. The last one is, let's go into setting intentions for the future week. So if I go back into the Manifest OS, let's go into maybe the current month. So we're going back in time a little bit to the start of October, and I'm going to open up the October page. This is also its own database, so we've got weeks, months, and quarters. One really cool thing about setting up these databases is you could say, show me how I did on this habit, let's say it's journaling, for the entire month, and what percentage of days did I complete that habit. As an example, where we're not really interfacing with this page too much, but it does do a really good job of consolidating information using a simple roll-up. So this is also something that's tied to the template. But if I go into entries, let's say make progress on your I can add a note directly within here. So if it's not existing in the database, you can just click new, and it's created a new entry. And then I can always go in here and tag it journal entry, and it's automatically connected to October, and it's organized in this journal. So if those are three scenarios in which you're capturing notes in the moment and being able to go back into them and organize them based on whatever filters or tags you set up. If we were to go back into the demo space and we go into notes, let's make sure this is sorted by last edited. This is an everything all at once view of notes. And what's really helpful about this, even though we're not interfacing with this on a regular basis, is it shows you every property related to notes. So like what notebook it's tied. If the notebook entry is empty, you could also go in and update that information here. The type of journal entry or note entry it would be categorized as. If what notes are in inbox or archive. And if we keep going, this is something that's expanding from the notes template that we looked at earlier, but all of the other databases that it's connected to. So these definitely do not need to be filled in for every note, but in some cases, you might have notes that are filtered to only show things that are part of weekly planning or reflection or monthly planning, things like that. And if we say jump into daily journal, let me just see how this is set up. But this will show, as an example, every note that's considered a journal entry. And if we sort it from latest to earliest, you can start to see kind of like a chronology of, in this case, journal entries. But the same thing would go for if you're setting intentions for projects or if you're writing down goals. You could filter to only show those notes, which is something where it's kind of like massively leveling up when we compare it to like a physical notebook. But it's very hard to find specific notes that I'm looking for in like previous notebooks, like physical notebooks. So that's just to give some context as to how we can set up notes as its own thing just to get up and running and organizing notes in Notion versus what role they might play in your workspace if you're tracking things like projects or you are using it as a daily planner. Again, there's like a lot of variety, which is why you don't have to necessarily connect it to other databases from day one. You could build the habit of creating notes, start to identify like what tags make sense based on how I'm using it, and then over time incrementally decide, hey, it'd be nice if I could connect my notes to projects, for example. And then if we go back into just some takeaways on this before, if we've got questions, we can tackle those. 4 kind of key things that I found to be most helpful in terms of having your own system that prevents that like note overload graveyard scenario from happening, which is definitely very common. And it came down to these 4 things. So 1, not that it's mandatory, but finding a platform that you're most comfortable and allows you to not only quickly capture notes, but be able to find and retrieve them. It's relatively easy to export or migrate from one tool to another if you do decide to like consolidate your stuff in a new place or platform. Second thing is review frequently. So we're doing a lot of the heavy lifting of capturing notes and ideas and really comparing that to like the review is a pretty light lift, right? It's just kind of going back in saying, is this helpful? Will it be helpful for my future self? And if so, how can I tag it or add it to a notebook in a way that's going to make it easier to find in the future? And the last 2 things, 1 is don't be afraid to archive. Now, if you use that archive checkbox, it removes it from view, but if you ever want to go back into your archive, you can still technically find it. So you're not deleting it forever, but you are hiding it from view and making sure that it's not a distraction. And then the last thing is leveraging some sort of tagging or notebook system to make these accessible. So a simple tag could be business, personal, or you can get granular into like specific courses that you're taking or projects that you're working on as an example of how granular you can get with it. And then one last thing to note before we get into the Q&A, when we connect notes to other databases like projects, you also get the benefit of setting up templates so that you could see your notes within your projects and you don't have to set up those filters. So the magic of databases is in creating a template and seeing your tasks, your notes, and your documents all pre-configured the way you want it so that you don't have to set those up for every project, which is something that is harder to do when we just have notes that live on their own and then have to rely on search to find those. So with that said, I definitely want to open it up for questions. Crystal, when you journal daily, does it automatically task it to the week and day when you're in the daily board? So if we jump into that, for example, if I'm in Wednesday, this is a days database and I've got my entries here. So this is just surfacing the entries that we made here. But if I jump into any one of these, we'll notice that I've got a few things set up. 1, it's tied to the daily journal notebook. So if I were to open that, this kind of gives me all of the daily journal entries because they're automatically tied to it. And then it also ties it to the daily planner day. The one thing it doesn't do is connect it to the week because the week's database is limited to weekly planning, like setting intentions for the week or reflection for the week. So that's kind of its own filter. There probably is a way to set up this journal entry so that it's connected to both the daily planner and the week. We'll probably have to explore that a little bit further. Hope that answered your question. Side note, so this is the template library that we're working on for the community. So these are all going to be available in the open channel. Importing tasks from Asana. One thing to note, not related, but that's okay. We're here, so we can dive into that also. There's an import option in your sidebar. And if we do import from Asana, what that does is kind of do like a full import, but doesn't quite sync. So I'm not sure if you're thinking like migrating or syncing. If it's syncing, you probably need a tool like Zapier or Make to update, let's say you're working in Asana, but you want it to populate in Notion. You would probably have to set up an automation for that. In terms of importing, it's definitely gotten a lot easier to import from places like Evernote, Trello, Asana. For migrating purposes, where like you're kind of grabbing everything and then plan on having it live in Notion from there on out. Hope that answers your question. Great question, Crystal. Unfortunately not. This has kind of been a sticking point for makers for a while. The way that I'm trying to approach it is for the new version, focusing on in the community, going through deep dives of some of the new views that have been set up for the new version, so that if you're working in a previous version, it's definitely more work than it's worth to try to migrate it into a new template, mostly because you're gonna probably lose some important connections. But instead, trying to focus the community content to go through deep dives and walkthroughs on how to set up your own views for things like setting up an actions hub, for instance, which is not part of the previous version. So that's been the workaround. Also, one of the limitations of templates, in my opinion, we love the ability to like push an update to your workspace, but it doesn't exist. So as a result, focusing on like more of the learning and skill building with a big goal of everybody building their own workspaces, whether or not you're using a template as a starting point. Rocky, how would you add the notes into a previous made page or database such as a university page? I would probably, if it's a new database, probably makes sense to kind of keep it on its own, at least when you're starting to build the habit of like organizing notes in Notion, if you do decide on that route. The best way to think about it is, where would you want to surface your notes elsewhere in your workspace? So if, for example, I don't have notes connected to anything else, but I would love to have notes as part of projects. So for example, if I go into demo space, if we open up projects, I can see my timeline. I'm working on this webinar. Let's say you want to see your notes related to this project. That would be a way to decide, hey, let me try to relate these two databases so that way I could connect them and that serves as its own notebook as an alternative. I hope that answers your question. Cool, yeah, and Crystal, with the weekly planner, the key differences, there's actually not a lot. So that's a good idea of putting together a walkthrough of the differences between the weekly planner and the newest version of Manifest to see, what are some new databases and how could we rebuild those in your current workspace. So I think that's a pretty good idea I'm working on. Cool. All right. Hope that was helpful. Those of you who are interested in learning more about the community, I'm definitely going to do a follow-up sharing more info about it. And if you also want to learn more about Manifest, you can go to manifest-os.com. And if you're on Twitter, Instagram, you can definitely connect. Would love to connect with all of you at Notion Coach. But yeah, that's it. That's all I got. Hopefully see you in the next session, which is probably going to be in November, December. But have a great rest of your Wednesdays.